For today's video, we have finally gotten our hands on the all-new 2018 Buick Enclave. As with the previous generation of the Enclave, this is related to the Chevy Traverse as well as the GMC Acadia, but the relationship is very different this generation than it was in the past. The last generation of the Acadia, the Traverse, and the Enclave were frequently referred to as General Motors SUV triplets because they were almost identical in some configurations. But for 2018, General Motors decided to split the models apart. The Buick Enclave and the Chevy Traverse remain one of the largest three-row crossovers in this segment in America, whereas the Acadia has shrunk significantly by about a foot in order to compete more directly with the Toyota Highlander. General Motors is cementing the more premium positioning of the Buick by giving this a new Avenir trim as well. That is the top-end trim of the Enclave. Now, we're not driving that today, we're driving one trim level beneath it. But that helps the Buick compete more directly with the likes of the Acura MDX, especially the Infiniti QX60. Personally, I think the new Enclave is the most attractive crossover General Motors has ever made. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below, and let me know how you think this compares to some of the Cadillac crossovers and, of course, the new GMC Acadia. Up front, we have projector beam headlamps with distinctive lamp strips right there inside the headlamp module, as well as lower on the bumper right next to the turn signals. These are not fog lamps low on the vehicle, these are actually the turn signals right there. At just over 204 inches long, the Enclave has grown over the previous generation, and that means that this is now about 4 inches longer than a Volvo XC90 or an Audi Q7. It's also notably longer than an Acura MDX, with which it logically competes. One of the biggest differences, however, between the previous generation Enclave and this one is the wheelbase. That's the distance between the front wheels and the back wheels. It has definitely grown in this version, and that gives us more interior room for passengers. Moving to the back, we find a chrome strip that mirrors what was going on the front grille, twin integrated exhausts standard in all Enclave models, and well-integrated parking sensors in the one that we're driving today. As with previous generations of the Enclave, the hatch is wide and fairly vertical for a three-row crossover, and that helps improve the cargo practicality that we find behind it. Instead of a small displacement turbocharged engine like we find in many of the European competition, Buick has decided to stick with their tried and true 3.6-liter V6. This produces 310 horsepower and 266 pound-feet of torque in this form. Power is routed to the front wheels by default via a new 9-speed automatic transmission. I'll dive into the transmission in greater detail in the drive section, but thanks to the new transmission design and the fact that the Enclave has lost weight for 2018, fuel economy comes in at 21 miles per gallon combined for the front-wheel drive model. If you choose the optional all-wheel drive system, that does drop down to 20 mpg. Your mileage will of course vary, but one thing worth noting is that the all-wheel drive system in this vehicle can be disconnected. There's an all-wheel drive enable disable button on the dashboard that we'll see in a little bit, and that causes the rear axle to disconnect, improving your fuel economy. So if you do choose the all-wheel drive model, you may actually get identical fuel economy to the front-wheel drive model in real-world driving. That's definitely what we've been seeing during this week. Tires have a big impact on the way a vehicle behaves out on the road, so it's worth noting that for 2018 the tires have become a little bit wider. We have 255 width tires on this Enclave. However, they're not that much lower in terms of profile. These are 55 series tires, and that refers to the proportion of tire to wheel that we have going on the vehicle. Speaking in general terms, the higher the aspect ratio of the tire, so the larger that number is in the middle, the more cushion you're going to have to soak up bumps on the road. Helping improve things further, in the top-end Avenir trim, you have the availability of an optional adaptive suspension system. Buick has set the rated tow capacity of this vehicle at 5,000 pounds when properly equipped. That's pretty average for a three-row crossover in America as far as top-end towing ability, but it is notably below the average luxury full-size SUV. So if you want to tow heavier weights, you may need to look at something like a Cadillac Escalade, which will definitely tow more than this. When evaluating a vehicle, obviously comparisons are important, and a vehicle like this Buick can make some of these comparisons a little bit tricky, because the Enclave slots somewhere between your average mainstream three-row crossover and a full-on luxury branded crossover, so you won't find the same level of options, gadgets, gizmos, etc. inside this cabin that are available in a Volvo XC90 or an Audi Q7. Although you could compare this to those as sort of the value alternative, because in lower end pricing, those models obviously could cost less than a top-end Buick Enclave. On the other hand, obviously the Buick is an upgrade from something like a Volkswagen Atlas or most trims of a Mazda CX-9. And that's why, although I found these seats very comfortable for my body shape, I am going to have to reduce the score from what we see in the XC90 or in the Q7 because these seats are not as adjustable. We don't find extending thigh cushions, four-way adjustable lumbar support, massage functionality available, inflatable bolsters, etc. Yet these seats are more comfortable than many mainstream options, which you could see this as an upgrade from. We also have a power tilt telescopic steering column, which we don't typically find in mainstream three-row crossovers. Before we go to the back, I should mention that the only cup holders available to second-row passengers are right here in the doors in this model. That's not my preference, because if you were to slam this door closed, you could end up in a situation where this cup would topple over and then spill right on the upholstery. Thanks to the extended length and the extended wheelbase that we find in this generation, second row comfort is very, very good. I'm going to give this 10 out of 10 points. Even though we're in the model with the optional two-pane moonroof, I still have about 2 inches of headroom left. I have plenty of legroom, and this seat is not slid all the way back. The second row in this model does slide forward and backward to help you apportion leg row a little bit more equitably between the front row, the second row, and the third row. If I were to move on over to this side of the vehicle, I still have a decent amount of legroom left, even though the front seat is all the way back in its tracks. The engineers have made third row access a little bit easier than some of the competition with a second row seat that can keep a child seat latched into position and still access the third row. Now, it's worth noting that this mechanism is a little bit heavier and a little bit harder to use than some of the competition, but you can keep that child seat latched into place and still get back there. Of course, thanks to the overall size of the Enclave, you don't always need to fold these seats forward in order to get into the third row. Because this is available only as a 7-seat vehicle, there's always going to be a pass-through between this row and the third row in the back. If you take a look at the chart on the side of your screen, you'll notice that even though this is notably longer than a QX60 in terms of overall length and wheelbase, we actually have a little bit less combined legroom overall than that smaller Infiniti. Some of that, of course, has to do with the way that legroom is measured, but some of it also has to do with the fact that Buick gives us a little bit more cargo room back there than we find in that QX60. Of course, legroom figures are not the only key to rear passenger comfort. Headroom is an important factor as well. And we actually find more headroom back here in the third row as well as the second row than that Infiniti. And that's why I think these are actually a little bit more comfortable than the third row seats that we find in that QX60. My sister-in-law will tell you that one of the big reasons to buy one of GM's large three-row crossovers is the cargo area in the back. At over 23 cubic feet of storage space behind the third row, this is easily class-leading, and this is almost 10 cubic feet more than you find in an Audi Q7. You'll find even more storage space under the load floor, where there's almost enough room to put a 22-inch roller bag there all by itself. There are also some additional hooks on either side to help secure your cargo. And that doesn't mean that Buick has skipped the spare tire, because you'll find that even further down there underneath this bin. Many shoppers keep their third row folded most of the time, and if that describes your family, then you will find more room back here than even large two-row crossovers like the Lexus RX. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in an upper-level trim, but not in the top-end trim. We have the two-pane moonroof option in this model, which gives us one over the front passengers' heads and then a completely separate sheet of glass right there over the second-row passengers' heads. That's definitely different than the panoramic sunroof option that we see available in some of the competition. However, like the average panoramic moonroof, the pane of glass over the second row passengers' heads does not open. Up front, we find fixed height shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. This is leather upholstery in this model. It is heated and ventilated, and you can see right there that we have perforations in the center sections of the seat back and bottom cushions to support that ventilation feature. The front door panels are made from a combination of materials. We have a soft-touch injection molded upper section, a soft-touched stitched middle section, and then hard plastics lower on the front doors. Because the Enclave straddles segments, parts quality inside sort of lands between segments as well. And that's why we don't find real wood trim in this cabin, and we also have those harder plastics lower on the doors and on the dashboard. But it's important to keep in mind that this is not going to cost as much as options that do offer real wood trim or some of those extra touches. Moving over to the dashboard, the overall design is very clean and elegant. I really like the way that Buick has tastefully reduced the number of buttons in this interior. We have a soft-touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard, then some stitched material right here in this middle section around the infotainment display and the air vents. Below that, we have some imitation wood trim that is tastefully done, and then some metallic trim that wraps around that air vent over there on the passenger side. The standard LCD infotainment system features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, and the model that we're driving here also features factory navigation. In kind of an unusual twist, Buick has decided to put the buttons that relate to the infotainment system below the screen, whereas the buttons that relate to sort of drive functions of the vehicle up higher on either side of the screen. So on this left side, we have the traction control off button, all-wheel drive engage and disengage, the tow mode engage and disengage, and then on the other side we have hazard lights, parking sensors, and lane departure warning, whereas below the screen in this different button module we have the home button, track forward, backward, a back button, and then the power and volume knob. Continuing our way down from there, we find the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control. The front 2 zones are directly controlled via these buttons, and then we press this climate button for the 3rd zone in the back, and then we hit the rear button inside this system and then adjust it from there. Underneath the climate controls, we find a storage cubby where you can easily put your large smartphone, 2 USB inputs, and an auxiliary input as well. The center console is also where we find the shifter. It's a European joystick design where we have park as a button right up top. There's an unlock button on the side, and we pull back for drive. It returns to center as you see right there, and then the D lights up. We toggle back again for the low mode, and then forward for neutral. If you want reverse, you press the button again, pull it all the way forward and then to the left, and that engages reverse. Again, you can see the shifter returns right there to center. Between the front seats, we find a large padded armrest, which opens to reveal a 2-tiered storage compartment. We have one tier right here that is removable. You can put wallets, that sort of thing, right inside, and then a much deeper storage bin where you can almost keep a gallon of milk. The instrument cluster continues the restrained and elegant design that we see in other Buick models, with white numbers on black faces and white needles. You'll notice the tachometer features an auto start-stop indication here on the left. That's because all Enclave models have it standard, and this is not user defeatable, so there is no button to turn this feature on and off. The steering wheel is a 4-spoke design that looks fairly similar to other General Motors steering wheels, with sport grips up top and leather wrapping in all models. On the left side of the wheel, we find the buttons that control the standard cruise control, the heated steering wheel functionality, that's what that indicator light right there shows, and then of course the pre-collision alert system. It's worth noting that only very top-end trims of the Enclave have the option to add adaptive cruise control, so the model we're driving does not have that functionality. We simply have that collision alert system. And then on the right side of the steering wheel is where we find track forward, backward, volume up, down, and then a button array that controls that multifunction display between the speedometer and the tachometer. The previous generation of the Enclave used a naturally aspirated V6 engine, which was a little bit different than some of the competition, and that hasn't changed for this generation. But what really has changed is the transmission, because this uses General Motors' brand new heavy-duty 9-speed automatic transmission, and that's a pretty big difference between the outgoing 6-speed. However, this transmission is not the same 9-speed automatic that we find under the hood of the Acura MDX, a number of FCA vehicles, or of course some of the Jaguar Land Rover vehicles either. This is an all-new, all-in-house General Motors design. The important distinction here is that the design of this 9-speed automatic is more similar to the average automatic transmission in America than what we see under those other hoods. Now there are some pros and cons to this. The biggest pro, of course, is that shifts in this transmission feel like a traditional automatic. If I floor this vehicle, it downshifts very aggressively, very immediately, and that's not something we see in the ZF 9-speed automatic transmission. However, on the flip side, the difference between low gear and the top gear is smaller in this transmission than it is in that ZF 9-speed. When you have a high ratio spread, you can have a very aggressive first gear for very quick launches from 0 to 30 or 0 to 60, and then you can have a very tall final gear for improved highway fuel economy. This transmission has to be a little bit more of a balance than the ZF 9-speed or the Honda 10-speed automatic transmission that we see in some of their new vehicles. On the other hand, that ZF transmission allowed the Acura MDX to have an incredibly aggressive, effective first gear ratio. And that's really obvious when you take a look at the 0 to 15, 0 to 30, and even the 0 to 60 times, because the MDX really is not that much lighter than this, and it also doesn't produce any more power than this, but it will get you from 0 to 60 faster than this. In our tests, this vehicle scooted up to highway speeds in 6.7 seconds, which means that it is behind the XC90 and the Acura MDX, but it is ahead of the QX60 and of course the Mazda CX-9. The CX-9 is not terribly swift because its turbocharged engine doesn't produce as much power as we see in some of those European turbo engines. But this is right around the same 0 to 60 time as the current generation BMW X5 with the 3-liter turbo engine. In our braking tests, we stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 120 feet, which is definitely less than the outgoing model. 120 feet is respectable for a vehicle of this size and weight, but keep in mind that the luxury segment is full of crossovers that will definitely stop shorter than this. When it comes to handling, it's again important to remember the competition. This is not going to be competing with top-end XC90s or top-end BMW X5s because the price tag on the Buick is simply not that high. But this will compete with top-end versions of the Mazda CX-9, every version of the Acura MDX, and even some of the competitive Mercedes models. Keeping that in mind, the Enclave handles really quite well, especially if you engage the all-wheel drive system, because this does feature a torque vectoring rear axle. Now obviously, if you disengage the all-wheel drive system, you will get better fuel economy, but that is going to have an impact on the way the car handles. Now overall steering feel is not quite as good as the Mazdas, but overall handling ability really is just about there. Keep in mind the model we're driving has all-season tires on it, not sporty summer tires that you will find in some of the competition, especially those European competitors. The last generation Enclave was known for its supple ride, even on broken pavement and rougher roads like the gravel road that we're on right here. And even though this generation of the Enclave has become sportier than the last generation, they haven't forgotten about customers that are looking for a comfortable ride in their three-row crossover. Depending on the version of the Enclave you get, this is definitely in the same realm as the Infiniti QX60, which is also a very comfortable three-row vehicle. Now the version we're driving with the 255 width tires and the 20-inch wheels is notably firmer out on the road than the base version or the top-end trim with the optional adaptive suspension system. Back out here on this rough paved road, the attention to the ride quality in the Enclave is very noticeable. This road is very, very rough, but this car is doing an excellent job at soaking up those bumps and not getting upset over it. Some large vehicles can get upset when you really start pushing them hard in the corners, but this really does keep its composure. Now, if you're going higher speeds and you start really trying to crank the wheel, you will get obviously some unwanted body motions, but that's pretty much the norm for a large three-row crossover. When you really start pushing the Enclave harder out on your favorite winding mountain road, even a rougher one like this, it is very impressive how well this handles. This does not feel like a Toyota Highlander or a Honda Pilot out on the road. This really does fit in with that lower tier in the full-on luxury segment. Buick has had a long reputation for making very quiet vehicles, and this is no different. We scored 69 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quietest three-row crossovers that we've driven. This easily belongs in the luxury segment in terms of overall cabin quietness. Then Buick tops things off with an active noise cancellation system to help counteract anything that does make its way into the cabin. Now, in an interesting move, there is a little bit more engine noise coming through the cabin than we see in some of the competition, but this does have a naturally aspirated V6 engine, so that engine noise is actually quite pleasing. Over a week of mixed driving, we've been averaging just under 21 miles per gallon, which is a little bit above what the EPA says we should get. And I credit this disconnecting all-wheel drive system for that, because for the most part, I have been driving this vehicle in front-wheel drive mode. Obviously, driving around in front-wheel drive mode has an impact on the available traction, as well as the handling ability if you're pushing the vehicle hard, but for most driving situations, you can comfortably keep this in the front-wheel drive mode and save some gas. Now, it's worth noting, as I said earlier, that you cannot disable the auto start-stop system in this vehicle. And because weather has been fairly mild at this point in California, the engine has been stopping a great deal. Now, if you were to crank the air conditioning all the way up in a hotter climate, the engine would not stop when the car comes to a stop, and therefore you wouldn't be saving quite as much fuel. Possibly because Buick was so interested in fuel economy for this vehicle, we don't have a true manual transmission mode. All we have is D and the L mode that I showed you earlier. And L is sort of a suggestion to the transmission to limit the top gear to whatever is indicated. So right now it's indicating L6. That means that the transmission can use gears 1 through 6. And if I were to go down to, say, gear L1, it's not going to allow me to actually shift into first gear. It's going to be blinking that first gear, but it also might not get down to second gear either, depending on the speed of the car. So again, it's more of a suggestion. Although this system does not allow me to command a specific gear, when it's in L3 as it is right now, it will never use fourth gear. This generation of the Enclave definitely surprised me because the previous generation wasn't really noted for its handling prowess. It had a soft ride, it was comfortable, but it didn't really handle all that well, and it was fairly heavy. It was almost 5,000 pounds in top-end all-wheel drive trims. This vehicle has been put on a significant diet even though it is bigger than the last generation model, and as a result it definitely feels notably more eager out on the road. Now this does not handle quite as well as top-end versions of the XC90 or the Audi Q7 or the BMW X5, but they're really in a different category. Instead, this is a very compelling alternative to something like the Infiniti QX60, because this definitely handles better than a QX60, even though it has a comfortable ride, excellent fuel economy scores, and a really big third row back there. The comfortable ride and of course the quiet cabin really are strong selling points for this vehicle, because a lot of three-row crossovers out there, when they try and go for better handling, they have to give up ride quality and they have to give up cabin quietness, and this is an excellent blend of all three. When it comes to pricing and comparisons, the most important thing to remember about the Buick Enclave is that it is a premium vehicle, not a mainstream vehicle and not a traditional luxury vehicle either. It sits in this in-between ground where really very few brands lie. That means that at $39,995 starting, it is about $7,000 less expensive than a Volvo XC90, about $10,000 less expensive than an Audi Q7, but more expensive than a comparably equipped Toyota Highlander. In the United States, the most direct competitors for the Enclave would be the Acura MDX, which is smaller than the Enclave, and the Infiniti QX60, which is not too far off in terms of overall size. The overall positioning of the Enclave is a little bit tricky, but it does make sense, because the Chevy and the GMC crossovers are what compete with the Toyota Highlander, the Honda Pilot, etc., and the Cadillac crossovers are in theory what will be competing with the three-row luxury crossovers from Audi, Volvo, Mercedes, etc. Of course, I realize that at the moment we don't have a Cadillac three-row crossover, but at some point we probably will. Because of the overall positioning, the base model of the Enclave is very, very well equipped, but we don't find leather upholstery in that trim. You have to jump up one trim in order to get that. The model we were driving was essentially a fully loaded premium trim, which is just one tier below the Avenir trim. The Avenir trim adds a few things that were not available on the model that we were driving. However, you'll notice that we still don't find the same level of luxury content that we find in the luxury competitors like the BMW, the Mercedes, etc. The key takeaways for the Enclave mainly relate to the fact that Buick again sits in this middle land between mainstream and luxury. That's why we find a longer standard warranty than something like a Highlander or a Pilot. We also find a high level of standard equipment, the standard V6 engine, standard 9-speed automatic transmission, etc. But we also don't have the same kind of optional luxury gadgets and goodies that we find in the full-on luxury options. Fuel economy is relatively good for the Enclave. Obviously, the interior is very roomy because of the overall size as well. When it comes to vehicle dynamic comparisons, things do get a little bit tricky. Acceleration is good for a mainstream vehicle, but obviously not as good as high horsepower luxury vehicles. Handling is also quite good for a vehicle the size of the Enclave, but it doesn't have some of the fancier suspension designs that we see in the full-on luxury brands. So again, this kind of lands somewhere in the middle. Starting at $44,200 and ending under $60,000, the Acura MDX is one of the very close competitors to the Enclave. It also lands somewhere in this middle ground because obviously it is better equipped, it's more of a luxurious vehicle than the Honda Pilot, but it doesn't have the same level of equipment, functions, etc. that we find in the full luxury brands either. Comparably equipped to the top-end trim of the Buick, it's going to cost you around $56,000. That is a little bit more expensive than the top-end Buick. However, we do find a few more gadgets and gizmos in the Acura that we don't find in the Buick. That means that if you were to adjust the price based on the feature content that we find in both models, they end up really roughly the same price. And that makes sense because both Acura and Buick are playing in this same pool. In terms of overall size, the Acura MDX is smaller than the Enclave, and that is noticeable on the inside. We get less cargo room, and we definitely get less third row room than we find in the Buick. It's also a 7 or a 6 passenger vehicle, so if you get the top end trims of the MDX, you lose one seat versus what we're seeing in the Enclave. Performance is excellent in the MDX thanks to its ZF 9-speed automatic transmission, although it's not as smooth as what we find in the Buick, as I said before. Handling is excellent in the MDX thanks to its torque vectoring all-wheel drive system, and it's worth noting that even though the Buick has a torque vectoring rear axle, it's not the same level of torque vectoring that we find in the Acura. The Acura is capable of sending more power to a single rear wheel than the Buick is because it can overdrive the rear axle just a little bit to help give it more of a rear power bias. And that's why the MDX in certain trims is a very solid handling competitor to the BMW X5, and really no version of the Enclave is. Next up, we have the Infiniti QX60. It starts around $43,300, so basically in the same range that we see the Buick Enclave start. However, we do find standard leather upholstery in the QX60, and we don't find that in the Enclave. So once you've adjusted for those things, they're basically the same price overall. The QX60 is probably the toughest competitor for the Enclave because both vehicles are targeted at someone that wants a slightly more supple ride, something a little bit more comfortable on the inside, definitely quieter inside than the average performance vehicle, and definitely wants a lot of room inside for passengers. The QX60 is again one of the larger vehicles in this segment. And depending on the specification you're looking at, the QX60 may actually have a little bit more room in certain dimensions than the Enclave, even though again it is a slightly smaller vehicle overall. However, when everything is taken as a total, the Enclave is a little bit more comfortable, especially if you plan on putting adults in all 7 seats. It's worth noting that larger vehicles from Nissan and Infiniti with their continuously variable transmission seem to have higher long-term maintenance costs than traditional automatics, and I would expect long-term maintenance costs on the Buick Enclave to be lower than the QX60 overall. The QX60 and the MDX really are the two closest competitors to the Enclave, but we also have things like the Mazda CX-9 in its top-end signature trim that's definitely targeting this segment as well. Of course, the CX-9 Signature is not a separately branded vehicle, so it still does wear the Mazda badge, and therefore it is a little bit less expensive. At $44,600, the CX-9 Signature is more or less comparably equipped with the Buick Avenir. In some cases, we actually find a few more features inside the Mazda than we find in the Buick. However, we get less power out of its turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. In addition, Mazda still uses an older 6-speed automatic transmission, and that's why overall acceleration performance is definitely better in the Buick. Mazda puts real wood trim and a heads-up display in that top-end CX-9, and those are two things that we did not have in our Buick Enclave this week. Mazda's latest vehicles have proved to be very reliable, but Buick typically gets excellent reliability ratings, and it's worth noting that the warranty is actually longer on the Buick than the CX-9. That brings us along to the comparison that a number of you asked me to do on Facebook, the Volvo XC90. The Volvo and the Buick really aren't the same thing. They're not targeting the same shoppers, they're priced very differently, and the Volvo is definitely more expensive. A base XC90 will set you back $7,000 more than the base Buick. Now obviously we get more standard equipment inside the XC90. The interior is put together with greater precision. I think the exterior is also put together with greater precision. We find more standard gadgets, gizmos, etc. But the big difference, of course, is the available gadgets and gizmos that we see in the Volvo, because you can get your Volvo up to about $106,000. That's almost double the top-end price of the Buick Enclave. That's because we find features inside the Volvo that we just don't see in that Buick. We have things like suede headliners, full leather upholstery, massaging seats, much more adjustable, much more comfortable seats, Volvo's latest active safety systems, an available 4-corner air suspension, a much more costly double wishbone front suspension that really improves handling in that top-end trim, and of course Volvo's 400 horsepower plug-in hybrid system. That means that while you can see the Buick Enclave as a value alternative to something like an XC90 or a Q7 or a GLS, etc., they're really not the same kind of vehicle. Now, the Buick Enclave is undeniably a better value than the average large luxury crossover in America. The Buick will never feel quite as special as those full-on luxury alternatives, however, it is always going to be considerably less expensive. Depending on how you configure your Buick, that could be about $10,000 to $15,000 less than a comparably equipped and comparably performing XC90 or Audi Q7. So who's this Buick designed for? Well, the Enclave really is targeted to that shopper that wants a large and accommodating 3-row crossover, that wants something a little bit more special than the average mainstream entry but doesn't want to get crazy with the cost, and is looking for something that's very comfortable and very, very easy to live with. And that's something that kept coming back to me during my week with the Enclave. This definitely is a very easy to live with vehicle, and it reminds me a lot of the Infiniti QX60 in that way. It's comfortable, it's quiet. It does not pretend to be an overly sporty crossover or an overtly luxurious crossover either, but it really does play this middle ground extremely well. If you're looking for a large, comfortable 3-row crossover, definitely put the Buick Enclave on your shopping list, but I would say also give the Mazda CX-9 in its top-end signature trim a really good long look. It's not quite as large as the Enclave, it's not quite as comfortable in the back, Doesn't have quite the same kind of cargo room that we find in the Buick, but I think it plays the value card better than the Buick. The pricing is a little bit lower than the Buick Enclave Avenir. It's about $9,000 savings depending on how you configure the two vehicles. We find a few features in that CX-9 that we can't find on the Buick either. Now we do get a shorter warranty, and it's not a premium targeted vehicle. It is still a Mazda branded vehicle, but it does play that value card extremely well. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and if you want to support this channel, head over to patreon.com and find us over there as well. I'll see you next week.